Good morning. I'm Ellie Gold, president of the Gold Institute for International Strategy, a think tank based in Washington, D.C., focusing on national security and international affairs. Today, I thought it was important to have a conversation regarding what happened and the active assailant incident that happened in the synagogue in Texas over the weekend. This is something that has become a more than common occurrence over the past several years, within quite a few, or more than should be, active assailants in synagogue situations, whether it's in Pittsburgh or in California or in New York. And now, most recently, this past Saturday in Texas. It's important to find out to understand and find out what's going on and what happened in particular in Texas, and then and maybe even take the opportunity to compare it to some of the other synagogues in incidents recently. Joining me today is a Gold Institute law enforcement fellow, Marc Black. Marc spent much of his career with the NYPD and New York City Police Department, law enforcement, and spent much of his time there in terrorist units, as well as working with houses of worship. So let me bring in Marc to the conversation.
Good morning,
Marc. How are you?
Good morning.
So, Marc, you now, aside from your work at the Gold Institute, you now work with houses of worship across the country. I know you were invited to speak in Brussels to the European Parliament. That date to be determined, about this very issue as well. Really training synagogues on how to protect them, to protect their infrastructure, their facilities, not to be confused with necessarily with training individuals on how to respond, but we're talking about but maybe including, but you really train and work with houses of worship for these very incidents like happened on Saturday. Is that correct?
Yes, when I was with the NYPD, we did a lot of security and vulnerability assessments for houses of worship, among other types of sites, critical infrastructure sites. But my main focus was the houses of worship and how to protect them from active assailant attacks.
So this the reason why I asked you that question is because that makes you probably the right guy to have this conversation with, unfortunately. So it turns out on Saturday there was services were being held in a synagogue in Texas, and ultimately what happened was there were 4 people held hostage for more than 10 hours during that time. Luckily, this synagogue in particular, along with a whole host of others, did receive this type of training for the most part of what to do should an active assailant situation occur. So that probably saved the hostages, and kudos to the synagogue for taking care of that training over time. But if you can walk us through what happened, and we all read the news, we all watched what's going on, but from your perspective, we're looking at it from law enforcement's eyes. Can you walk us through what happened from the start of the services before the guy walks in to until he was neutralized by SWAT?
Well, of course, we can only go by open source information right now, and it's an ongoing investigation, as everybody's aware of. So with talking about tactics and what law enforcement was or was not doing, I'm not going to comment on that because we never know who's listening, and what other adversaries are out there who are trying to gain more information, if they have an interest in doing this sort of incident. So, from a tactical perspective, I'm not going to speak about what law enforcement does or does not do in these sort of situations. Also, I'm not privy to. I was not there at the scene. What I can speak to is that, once again, the Jewish community is a target. And, this is something that's going to be ongoing. It's pretty much never going to end. And I believe, and even when I was with the New York City Police Department, we have to reassess how we are doing our physical security at these synagogues. And basically, really, what we want to do is detect, deter, deny, and delay the attack. And that equals time and distance, enough time for the good people to distance themselves from the threat. And unfortunately, in this case, I am not privy to the security parameters or protocols of this synagogue, but we need to really reinforce our access controls into these synagogues and houses of worship in general. And later on in the discussion, we can talk more in depth about that. But from law enforcement perspective, um, uh, going into a active assailant and then going into a hostage negotiation type of incident. Kudos to the hostage negotiators here, keeping calm, cool, and everything in perspective to get the release of these hostages. That was very good on their part. Very good.
Um, so this active assailant, and his name is Malik Faisal Akram. He walks in and clearly chose this synagogue. Would that is that correct?
Yeah.
And what does it take for for him to? I mean, in my estimation, up until he was neutralized, it appeared as though what he intended to do, he was quite successful at. So 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 from his perspective, what did it take for him to pull off such an incident?
Well, we have to remember when we look at the attack life cycle of an individual who's going to conduct this sort of incident, we have to look at target acquisition. And one of the things here is probably knew the area. And once again, here's an attack that's not in a major city. And this is what what I try to say to many synagogues around the country, and to want to speak to the Jewish community, is it's no longer has to be in a major city such as New York, Boston, Chicago. The individual who's looking to attack a Jewish institution can definitely get the same local, regional, national, and international coverage for whatever their mantra is. That being said, also another reason is we have to look at police response times in these sort of incidences too. In a big city such as Chicago, Boston, New York, response times are much quicker. Where in the other areas, when this sort of incident happens, pretty much the individuals inside the premise have to really think on their own to avoid the threat. The question is why? As as we've seen in many attacks, most of the suspects or the criminal element had some sort of understanding of the environment. The environment is not only knowing the target, in this case the synagogue, but also knew probably the road system. I'm only speculating here, and probably understood how the roads operate, ingress, egress, maybe have passed it a few times, maybe have had contact with the community in and around that area. So it doesn't surprise me. Criminals are like water, and they want the path of least resistance. And that once again brings me to, security. Why was this chosen? What did this individual know about the synagogue itself? What contact was made by the individual in the local area, understanding the area, and then understanding the actual synagogue itself. So these are questions that law enforcement wants to ask, or can't ask them now because this gentleman was stopped by law enforcement and eventually killed. But these are questions that need to be asked to prepare us to deter another attack on a synagogue or house of worship.
Do you see similarity? I mean, let me be clear here. Right now, it is Monday. 2 days. It's really maybe a day and a half since since this attack. There's so much more to learn. Based on what you have seen, people you've spoken to, and so on. Are there similarities to other synagogues?
Yes. If we look at the past attacks on just about every house of worship and synagogue, the question comes, how did the bad guy gain access? Where are the layers of protection? Or better stated is, what was the security and how was it deployed? And my thing is, I always say to every house of worship that, all right, these are expensive endeavors. Security is an expensive element. But if there's one place where you have to put your resources, it's on your access control systems. And access control systems are just not at the front door. They're also your back doors, your loading docks. You have to look at your emergency exits as well, the roof. So what has made all these, and by nature, houses of worship are open, what has made all the attacks, if you look from in the past in history, through all the attacks of houses of worship that have happened, it happens because the access controls were not robust. And that's how the bad guys, remember, bad guys are like water. They want the path of least resistance. So we have to start looking at our access control systems a little more. And we also have to get out of our psyche. Well, it's not going to happen to us. It's going to happen over there. That mentality no longer we cannot have that in our mindset anymore. And particularly in the Jewish community, we have to take the position now. Unfortunately, being Jewish, you're a target. That's the bottom line. And you live your life every day. You should not be intimidated by the radical element, by the people who want to commit harm. But we do have to protect ourselves. We do have to protect ourselves.
So you bring up a very good point, and I'm going to come back to the law enforcement side of things. But you do bring up a very good point, and that is, there are about 2% of the population are Jewish, 2.5%. Yet about 60% of hate crimes are against the Jewish community. So, do you believe that it made sense that so quickly the FBI should make the statement that they don't believe that this was anti-Semitism, but rather an isolated incident for other purposes?
So my question is, why didn't this individual? I think this has been stated throughout a lot of commentators and through within the Jewish community themselves. Is, if that's the case, why didn't they go to a church? Why didn't this individual go to a shopping mall? Why was this synagogue targeted? And that's the question that law enforcement has to ask. I do not know the rationale on why the FBI would make that statement. Early in the investigation, when we know that from open source information, there were 2 individuals picked up in London. I don't know what they had, what they were talking to the British on. But even so, let's say hypothetically, this guy could have had some type of mental disability, whatever it is. it still goes to the fact that the synagogue was targeted. The synagogue, this individual made access into a Jewish institution. That's the bottom line. For the motivation to go in, if the FBI wants to say it was something else, does not make a difference. This individual entered a Jewish institution, and this is why the Jewish population has to really get on board with looking at what are our protocols, policy, programs, and procedures, and protocols for their Jewish institution from a protection management perspective. And this is extremely important, Ellie, and I mean this sincerely. And I'm from law enforcement, okay?
Sure.
And I want to make this statement, and it's going to be a very difficult statement for a lot of individuals to accept. But having been involved with what we call in law enforcement mass casualty incidents, or what they call in civilian law severity incidents.
Sure.
And these types of incidents, the individual institution, the Jewish institution, the house of worship, cannot rely on law enforcement. What I mean by that is the time law enforcement, the good guys, arrive on the scene, the incident has already been done or stopped. We saw that in Pittsburgh. We saw it in Poway. The first line of defense and the duty of care for the safety and security of that Jewish institution, and the responsibility and accountability and the inherent liability of that too, begins with that Jewish entity. They are the first line of defense. I'm not talking about investigations here. I'm not talking about the good work investigators do or what have you. I'm talking about when the incident kicks off, law enforcement is probably not going to be there unless they have some sort of fixer post at the house of worship itself. So there has to be more robust security at these institutions, and that is the lesson. When you look at all these incidents, they are very fluid, they are very dynamic, and they are very quick. The time that someone makes a 911 call, and then that 911 call is then sent to dispatch, and then dispatch then sends it to a radio car for response, we are talking minutes, and minutes are too long. So we have to be self-reliant. The houses of worship, particularly the synagogues, have to be self-reliant and have to do a lot more for their security, an enormous amount.
Let's take a step back. Now you spent time on NYPD's Counterterrorism Unit, and NYPD has probably a better counterterrorism unit than many countries across the globe. This is something that's known. This is something that is not recent, but what I've recently learned, not that long ago, was that NYPD was in particular called during the investigation in the shooting of President Abraham Lincoln. So that's how far back the expertise of New York Police Department goes. Let's talk about this individual, this terrorist. Clearly, he got through the system. His system is not perfect in anywhere, whether it's in New York or in Texas or in Poway or anywhere else across the globe. You remember what's the famous line? We have to be right 100% of the time. They have to be right only 1% of the time, right, or only one time period. Let's talk about what we see happening right now, and what appears to be the rise of terroristic type of activities, whether they're classified as terrorism or not. This individual clearly has ties to Al Qaeda, as his demand was to was the release of Lady Al Qaeda. His ties to radicalism is clear based on as you mentioned before, the apprehension of these two in the UK. Based on his statements that he's made, how he wished he could have been part of the 9/11 attacks. Which means, by the way, a statement like that means that he does not mind dying for the cause. Let's put you back in the field. You're back at NYPD. What are you thinking? What are you looking for? And I'm not asking you to give any secrets that people who are listening shouldn't hear.
Right.
But give us the mindset. What are we looking at? And not necessarily specifically regarding synagogues. I'm talking about the country. There are many people who are wondering. The question that's always asked that is how did he get here? What's going on? Yeah. What do we need to know from your perspective?
So basically, it's called a workup, and we're going to have to, the law enforcement agencies that are involved in this investigation are going to do a workup on this individual, on this perpetrator. Of course, now it's going to be a little more challenging because he was stopped. What I mean by stopped, he was killed. So now they're going to have to go through all communications, everything that's done in an investigation, who's he's reached out to and spoke to. What was the mental disposition of this individual? Are there any family members in the area who can speak to? And of course, what are the ties between this individual and what we're hearing in open source that two individuals in London were picked up? So they're going to be doing a lot of workups, finding out more information about this individual's background, finding out if he's associated with any terroristic groups out there, looking into every single thing that you can imagine, finances, everything that's looking over his technologies, meaning of course, his cell phones, his computers, everything you can imagine. They're going to basically do a deep dive into this guy's background. As far as from, and of course, they're going to be communicating overseas too with law enforcement overseas in Great Britain and London in particular to see what the connections are. And that's what they're going to do. They're going to try to make connections, put all the dots together and see if they have a reasonable understanding of what this individual is all about and find out, what associations were. And that's how they're going to run this investigation. Of course, if the individual was still alive, they would be doing the investigation, the interview, and the interrogation, and finding out more about him on a one-to-one in what we call the box. That's the interview room.
So are you concerned at all about my perception is that there's a rise, that there seems to be a rise in terrorism. Now, I may be using the term terrorism differently than the way law enforcement uses terrorism. So feel free to correct me on that. And the next question I'm going to pose to you is not a political question. I mean, I guess some may take it that way, but this is a realistic and practical question, and that is the more porous borders that we have currently, and that's, looking at the numbers, that's not the numbers of apprehensions. That's not a subjective statement. That's a factual statement. Do you believe that is something that's contributing to the situation?
Well, I don't know if here's the thing. You have to ask yourself, and I think somebody within the federal government can better ask this, particularly dealing with the border, is how many people who are true terrorists have been apprehended. And we hear bits and pieces in open source media, but nothing is really being mentioned. So yes, besides terrorism, we also have the drug trade that's expanding that we know of and we see in our communities. So yes, anytime you have something that will allow the criminal element to basically, there's nothing there to deny them to walk over a border. As I'll go back to my saying, criminals are like what? Water. They'll find the path of least resistance, and the borders now are porous. Now, was this individual, were they here on a visa? Were they a legal citizen? Did they have a green card? That's going to come out when the investigators do a workup on this individual. Um, my thing is, when you have these open borders, these individuals can start to assimilate. Now, I'm speaking from a terrorist perspective. I'm not going to speak from an individual who crosses the border illegally and is looking to get a job here and better the life. From a terrorist perspective, you have to think of this. If they are just coming across the border there, then do they already have a safe haven set up when they come here? Because if they go through the airport system, there's checks and balances within the airport system, right? For security. We know that, no fly list, something could be flagged. If you come in on a border and you're unchallenged and there's already a safe haven here, then it's easier to assimilate. Now, imagine if they speak English, and it makes it that much easier that they can assimilate even quicker into the society. So the question is, how many of these individuals are assimilating into society, melting away, and are amongst our working day communities? I don't know what's happening on the federal level of tracking these individuals. And first off, why should we even bother? When you say tracking the individuals or coming over, you wouldn't have to do that if the border was already established as a place that can detect, deter, deny, and delay these sort of elements, just like at an airport. But there's always going to be porous borders. But now we really have to look at this from a national security perspective, and that's out of my lane to speak on. I think there's some very bright people who can figure this out. The question is, will they put a game plan in place to stop this?
So, I'm going to pose this question to you, and I do this often with people when I have conversations with them after specific incidents or otherwise. You're testifying in front of the committee, the Homeland Security Committee. You as an expert, and they say to you, "Okay, what do you want to see from us, lawmakers, after incidents like this? What does this tell us? What do we need to know? What do you want us to do? Is there anything you want us to do?" What would you say to them?
Well, the first thing that we always can use and have a little better system on is the communication process between law enforcement agencies, whether that agent is speaking federal to local, or local to federal, or federal to state, and state to local, local to state, local to local. I think we do a pretty good job, but that's always a place where we can have the most cooperation is the communication. Once the flow of information and communication is established, it makes our job in law enforcement a little better. So putting in more robust systems of communication. When I was there, we had a really good communication with federal law enforcement. Even when I was with the Arson Explosion Squad, we had that communication, as well as within the computer crime squad. So I think we really need that to be done. But there's something else here, Ellie. There's something else here that people are not speaking about, which is greatly going to affect this. When we look at terrorism and these attacks, the first point of contact to stop this is, a lot of times, it's going to be local law enforcement. The feds are doing their investigations, and they might get a tip and do it. But when we're talking about porous borders or the unknown, is this individual here or not? It's going to be local law enforcement who's going to be stopping the individuals, or who are going to be responding. The first responders are going to be responding to the incident, such as in this case. My biggest concern is because of the fund the police movement. It wasn't about defunding the actual budgets from police departments. It was actually reducing the retention rates of personnel within the police departments. All over the United States, we see a mass exodus of police leaving departments. And you have to wonder, does the bad guy realize this? Now, of course they do. We see a spike in crime. But now let's take it up to the individual who wants to commit an active assailant attack. Well, let's take you have a small community. And maybe this small community or a suburb of, they might have 60 police officers, maybe 10%, 6 officers left. Well, that's kind of a big hit, a big hit. There was just a thing in Austin, Texas, whereby they had to take police officers for monitoring sex offenders and put them back in patrol cars. Well, now who's doing the monitoring of the sex offenders? The same thing here holds true, is that if you're releasing cops off the street, then that means you are lessening the probability of making contact with a bad guy. And that is a significant deficit within the safety and security of our communities throughout the United States.
You make a very, very valid point. And what I think we see happening in real time, we focus on strategy, the Gold Institute for International Strategy. We focus on strategy, whether it's on defending the homeland, in which this falls in, and you fall onto that team at the Institute. And what a stellar group of people, you and your colleagues on that in that group. But even in international affairs, we talk about strategy. And when you do that, when we say, okay, here is what we are attempting to achieve, and let's put forth, okay, what's the second and third and fourth order effects of each and every decision that we make? Well, we're seeing that real time here with defund the police. And now again, I can't speak, and I don't know if you can either, but I suspect that what happened here, which appears to me to be handled pretty well by law enforcement. I mean, kudos to the law enforcement on the ground, and in particular, also kudos to the to the civilians inside the synagogue with the way they handled it. No doubt their recent training certainly kept them alive in a big way. But the impact, these policies of defunding the police, or the limited prosecution or that we see happening from the district attorney's offices and so on, has a real impact and a quite negative impact as well. And in particular, as I would imagine, you happen to mention about sex offenders, but in particular, what does that do to our counterterrorism units as well? Yes. Something that you have talked about in many times before, which is that that not only are we concerned about the manpower that we're now lacking, but we're also lacking that mentorship of those new officers that are coming in. They don't have in many ways, the benefit of the experience of those who now just left, because it was time for retirement and they decided not to stay on, or just left because it wasn't worth it for them. So you make very good points here, and I think that this was a very enlightening conversation about what's happening on the ground. I do hope that we're going to have further conversations about this as information comes about. Maybe you'll be able to tell us, keep us informed about what's going through law enforcement's mind. What are we learning, and so on, because that's important for the American people to know, and people who are watching this to know. I'm going to give you, if you have any final thoughts, that you want to share? Otherwise, we can end it here.
No, just to summarize, with respect to what we were talking about, these type of attacks on synagogues and within the Jewish community, we can expect more of this. Anti-Semitism is not going away; it will be here, and our Jewish community has to. We have to start thinking a little more aggressively in what we do with our security. And also, a lot of these synagogues and Jewish institutions are going to have to come to the realization that they're going to have an independent operational security budgets that are appropriate for their physical footprint and also their adjacent properties to cover for security above and beyond any other sort of outside funding that they are receiving. And they have to have that because what they need to strive for is sustainable security. And that's also every house of worship. If you don't have that internally, and you are going to be setting yourself up eventually for incidents, because the bad guy is always doing surveillance. The bad guy is always looking for target acquisition, surveillance. They're always looking for the path of least resistance, like water. And if synagogues and other houses of worship can basically present themselves as being a so-called, not necessarily the hardest target, but a target that will deter, detect, deny, delay the incident or the attack, I think that these houses of worship and synagogues have a better chance of basically countering the threat. And that's very important. With respect to law enforcement today, something, it's very challenging out there. I still have friends who are working. This manpower shortage that's happening is affecting all these units, all departments nationally. And this is something that's going to take decades. The manpower shortage and the vocation of policing is going to take decades to correct. And that we can talk on a later topic as well on that issue.
Thank you, Marc. And for those who want to reach Marc for comments or questions on this or other topics related to law enforcement, I would recommend you visit the Gold Institute website at goldiis.org. And there is an area entitled Ask the Expert. You certainly should utilize that and to reach out to Marc. Thank you, Marc, and thank you for watching today.
Thank you very much, Alex.
I'm Martin Johnson with the Gold Institute for International Strategy. I've been in law enforcement for 36 years, 25 years of doing it, and 11 years of teaching it. I look for details and solutions. I always did. The Gold Institute does the same thing, paying particular attention to national security issues. Perspectives from domestic and international sources are always considered. They're always intertwined, no matter what the topic. The Institute uses research and active study as tools to define issues, look for solutions, find the pathways, establish goals, and get the ball rolling. You can write all the papers in the world and do all the research in the world, but if you don't get the ball rolling, how much good have you done? The Institute has solid leadership, has an awful lot of very smart people whom I've had the privilege to meet. I've learned a lot. You can learn a lot too. There's an awful lot of good work being done. Please feel free to check out the website, look at the mission statement, follow them up. It's worth it. It really is. I'm very happy to be part of it, and I look forward to continuing my relationship with the Gold Institute for International Strategy.